So it's PMQs Unpacked on Times Radio. I'm joined in the studio by Tim Shipman, political editor of the Sunday Times.
Hello, Matt.
Nice to see you here in person. We're not going to see Keir Starmer in person, though.
No, it's one out, one in, isn't it? We've had Boris Johnson doing it from his remote location, and today it's Sir Keir who will be phoning in from his beautiful home.
The novelty's slightly worn off from people appearing via Zoom. I mean, I'm not sure, given he's not exactly Mr Pizzazz, I'm not sure we'll necessarily notice much difference.
It'll be interesting to see whether the Labour Party has a better control of the sound than the government did when Boris Johnson was speaking to us from the bottom of a well.
What do we expect to come up?
Well, it's sort of exciting, isn't it, in one way and not in another, because Boris Johnson has two hot dates today, one with Keir Starmer and the other with Ursula von der Leyen, and the question is who gives him the more tricky questions about Brexit. The most interesting questions about Brexit might, though, come from the Tory backbenchers, who are all getting quite fired up. The Tory right worried that he's going to go off and sell the farm. Lord Ashcroft said that he wanted Boris Johnson to keep the lead in his pencil, not normally something that is a problem for the Prime Minister. But Edward Lee will doubtless be on his feet later. I think he's got a question, and various others as well, I'm sure, will be trying to keep him honest in these Brexit talks. But there's a lot to talk about the vaccine as well. You know, as you say, allergic reactions. We've got the vaccine boss talking about mixing vaccines. There's a lot Starmer could go on there too. Just
looking at the House of Commons, Boris Johnson, his hair, it's fair to say his hair is more trademark Johnson. It's sort of haystackish on the outer edges.
Well, he's got a big day. He needs to feel comfortable with his barnet, doesn't he? And it looks like he's mustered up nicely.
Interesting that Keir Starmer has chosen to do PMQs via Zoom this time round, whereas last time round he got Angela Rayner to do it, and she was quite good.
Well, as you pointed out last week, Angela Rayner was getting pretty punchy on Twitter last week as well, showing a bit of game, as it were. This is what you might get. And, Sir Keir is busy trying to establish his credentials with the public. He probably doesn't want a slightly punchy and quite impressive deputy getting in on the act.
Yeah, it was quite striking how Keir Starmer was keeping it fairly straight and steady on the question of rolling out the vaccine, while on Twitter Angela Rayner was basically socking it to Boris Johnson politically, which presumably goes down much better on Twitter. And in terms of Keir Starmer and Brexit, do you think he will ask questions about Brexit? Because Boris Johnson's got... We can already guess now probably what his comebacks will be about where Labour stand on Brexit these days.
Well, I think there are things he could do, because he could easily criticise Johnson for failing to get a deal and for having dragged it out this far and for being in quite a sticky situation in these negotiations, should he wish to. And given that will be the big news on the TV this evening, Starmer might take the opportunity to slip in a question and get his views on the record. But it wouldn't surprise me if he doesn't, because it's a subject he's often tried to avoid.
OK, we can go to the Commons and to Keir Starmer's house.
Resemble those of Australia's with the EU, or whether they're like those of Canada with the EU, I have absolutely no doubt that from January the 1st, this country is going to prosper mightily, Mr. Speaker.
That's just Boris Johnson answering a question from Edward Lee. Now, this is Keir Starmer.
Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I join with the Prime Minister in his comments about the vaccine rollout? It was fantastic to see the first person, Margaret Keenan, receive the vaccine yesterday. It's a huge national effort, and I want to thank everybody who's been involved with it. Mr. Speaker, can I also thank you and the House authorities for enabling me to participate today, notwithstanding the fact that I'm self-isolating. Mr. Speaker, a year ago, the Prime Minister stood on the steps of Downing Street and promised the country, these were his words, a permanent break from talking about Brexit. Can the Prime Minister tell us, how's that going?
I'm delighted to welcome the right honourable gentleman from his vantage point of exile in Islington, and wish him all his spiritual home, and wish him all the best in his self-isolation. But I can tell him that his own
not finding that very funny.
This matter has been sphinx-like. I think I wonder quite what it is, Mr. Speaker, that has kept him from asking this question for so long. We delivered Brexit, Mr. Speaker, on January the 31st, in case he failed to notice.
Well, there we are.
Well, yes.
There is that is one of
That
those
may be
things-
why Starmer hasn't asked too much about Brexit until this point.
Yes, and there's a really interesting debate going on in the Labour Party about, or within, the left-wing commentariat, as to whether or not Keir Starmer is a sort of strategic genius for the way he's, he was supposedly the architect of Labour's Brexit policy, and then he's tried to bury it, and then he might do something, or is he just, sort of buffeted about and doesn't really know what to do?
No, I think he personally took the view that he wanted to move Labour into a softer position. But as leader now, and having seen a load of seats disappear out of the door at the general election, he knows that he's got a pretty fine line to tread in terms of looking like he wants to overturn the result on the one hand, or placate his membership, which is fervently pro-European, on the other. I think reporting back on the sound, we can say that while Johnson was at the bottom of a well, Starmer sounds like he's locked in a small room, and it's a sort of bright white walls. It looks like an explosion in a white paint factory.
Yeah, he's found the least offensive background he could possibly find to try it, so that we're not picking over his kitchen cupboards.
There's
or whatever.
no books on the shelves
None
for us
at all.
to draw any conclusions from.
Okay, let's go back to the House of Commons.
Going back to Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, it's Camden, not Islington. Camden. And the Prime Minister starts straight away by deflecting. Same old, whether it's COVID or Brexit. 12 months ago, he told the British people that he had an oven-ready deal. He didn't say he had half a deal. He didn't say the next stage will be very, very difficult. In fact, he told the British people, this was before the election, he faced them and he told them, these were his words, that the chances of no deal were absolutely zero. And the now Chancellor obviously took him at his word, because the Chancellor said in the run-up to the election, we won't need to plan for no deal because we have a deal. So a year on, why should anyone who trusted the Prime Minister when he said he had a deal, including his Chancellor apparently, believe a word that he says now?
Let's just jump in there, because I suspect we can slightly preempt what Boris Johnson's going to... But this debate about when Boris Johnson said oven-ready deal, what was he referring to? Was it the deal to leave the EU or the trade deal that's currently being negotiated?
I mean, the problem is Boris Johnson wrote something in his manifesto. He said some other things out loud, and I'm afraid there was a degree of ambiguity. It is certainly possible for he and his team to say he was referring to the withdrawal deal that he had already done at the end of last year. Did he then give the impression to some people that meant that getting the next phase of the trade deal done and dusted would be more straightforward than is proven? I think that's a legitimate criticism as well. But certainly he said slightly different things at slightly different times. So depending on which bit you quote and when, you can draw either argument in your direction.
I do also seem to remember him telling us that once we'd left the EU in January, we'd never talk about Brexit again, which is quite turned out to
anyone
be
who believed that needs their head testing.
We can't about hope. And also, Keir Starmer appears to be standing up at home. The reason he sounds a bit strange is because he's appearing from home because he's self-isolated. He appears to have sort of built his own little lectern or something, or dispatch box, which is quite nice. Let's go back.
May help his speech deportment.
Get Boris Johnson's response.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I hesitate to accuse the right honourable gentleman of deliberately trying to mislead people, but let's be in no doubt that we had an oven-ready deal, which was the withdrawal agreement, by which the people voted for, as he rightly points out, by which this country left the customs union, left the single market, and delivered on our promises. And I can tell him that whatever happens, and you must know this, Mr. Speaker, that whatever happens from January the 1st, this country will be able to get on with our points-based immigration system, which we have put into law in fulfilment of our manifesto commitment. We'll be able to get on with instituting free ports, low-tax free ports in places where jobs and growth are most needed around the country. We'll be able to honour our promise to the British people and institute higher animal welfare standards, and we'll be able to do free trade deals, and we'll get our money back as well, Mr. Speaker. I don't know what else he wants to see from January the 1st, but all those things will be delivered.
Well, there we are. We might as well just go back to Camden now.
I see, Mr. Speaker. Apparently, get Brexit done just meant the first part of it, the easy bit. I don't remember that being written on the bulldozer at the time. Mr. Speaker, Last September, the Prime Minister actually hit the nail on the head when he said that leaving without a deal would be, in his words, a failure of statecraft. It would. It would be a total failure. And it will be the British people who pay the price. Does the Prime Minister agree with his own spending watchdog, the OBR, that the cost of that failure, of leaving the EU with no deal, would be higher unemployment, higher inflation, and a smaller economy?
Just before we hear from the Prime Minister, there's a certain risk to what Keir Starmer's doing here, because if Boris Johnson gets a deal this week, which lots of people think is not impossible, his sort of line of attack goes away, doesn't it?
A little bit, and also the attack that he made at the start of the question there, saying that Johnson did the easy bit, getting the deal last year. Those of us that covered 2 years of absolute parliamentary deadlock and disaster before Johnson went and shook hands with Leo Varadkar and did that deal might recall that it wasn't quite as straightforward as that.
It didn't feel quite that easy.
And it's possible he gets a deal this week. It's possible he doesn't. Clearly, it would have a political benefit for him if he were to do so, because it would seem like he'd done a good thing to most people, regardless of the detail. Other people would care deeply about the detail, of course. But yes, it's perilous, and that's why Starmer has been tiptoeing through this. And the other thing, even people in the Labour Party will say, well, hang on a minute. Keir Starmer was the one who pretty much blew up the Labour-Tory talks when Theresa May was Prime Minister. He wanted a referendum. And by taking a line that was trying to sort of put things on hold or potentially overturn them, he's ended up encouraging this slightly harder version of Brexit, and that's a criticism that a lot of people make. And
it's interesting, he's urging Boris Johnson to get a deal while there's this live debate in the Labour Party as to whether or not they would vote for or against any deal that he gets. Let's go back.
Speaker, the more he talks about Brexit, the more I can see why he tried to avoid the subject for the last for the last year. We did leave with a very good deal, and under any circumstances, this country will prosper mightily. And I may say to the right honourable gentleman, when he talks about the possible adverse consequences for this country of a deal on Australian terms, which I think is what he's talking about, we have yet to hear from the Labour Party what their view is of that matter. Would they vote for it? Yes or no? I mean, he remained totally Delphic last week, Mr. Speaker, about his policy on fighting coronavirus. He's totally Delphic about what to do on Brexit as well.
Keir Starmer looking a bit confused, actually.
Well, only the Prime Minister could regard Delphic as a clever insult. People start scrutinising their classical history to work out whether that's a bad thing or a very bad thing.
And all this talk of an Australian-style deal. Australia don't have a deal currently with the EU. They'd like to have
Australian-style deal, let's be frank, is the sophistry that the government comes out with to talk about not having a trade deal.
In the same way that Australian-style points-based system for him, because everyone thinks, the sun shines, holidays, swimming in the sea, that all sounds nice. The sun will shine more if we have an Australian-style deal. Let's go back. I think this is now question number 4 from a quizzical-looking Keir Starmer.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister talks about indecision. He is absolutely stuck. This is the truth of it. He's absolutely stuck and dithering between the deal he knows that we need and the compromise he knows his backbenchers won't let him do. Mr. Speaker, I genuinely hope this is the usual Prime Minister's bluster, and that, like one of his newspaper columns, a deal arrives at the last minute. But for some people and their jobs, it's already too late. Yesterday, Ineos, a major employer in this country, announced that they will not now build a new Grenadier car in Bridgend and will move production to France instead. This is a project that just 2 months ago, the Prime Minister said was a vote of confidence. So hundreds of skilled jobs now won't go to Bridgend. Can the Prime Minister tell us how many more British jobs have to go overseas before he gets on with delivering the Brexit deal that he promised?
Well, there's something quite funny about him accusing Boris Johnson of being absolutely stuck when he's literally stuck at home. this is another this whole question of the economic impact of Brexit and whether we leave with the deal or without a deal. It's going to be very hard to separate that from the economic impact of coronavirus, isn't it?
Well, that is the view of a lot of cabinet ministers, including people in the Treasury, that the Brexit bit will frankly just be something unpleasant floating on top of large seas. But Starmer, they're moving to what is much better terrain for him, which is, potentially economic costs, specific jobs going, projects not going ahead. And that's the kind of thing where I think he's going to have a lot more traction than on the questions he's asked so far.
And also, just this is what every good leader of the opposition does, trying to needle the Prime Minister and separating him from his own backbenchers and pointing out that actually the real challenge on Brexit doesn't really come from the Labour Party, it comes from Tory MPs.
Well, on that, he's right, isn't he?
Yeah, completely. Let's go back to Boris Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, I think it's a bit much of the Leader of the Opposition to criticise the government for failure to come up with a policy on Brexit, when he can't even, and a bit much for him to attack the putative consequences of coming out on Australian terms, when he can't even say whether he would vote for that deal, yes or no. If he can't say whether he would vote for our deal, yes or no, then he can't. Then I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, he simply cannot attack the government's policy until he is able to come up with a position of his own, Mr. Speaker, wrap a towel round his head, decide what he actually thinks. I find it very difficult to take his criticisms seriously, but what I can say is that this country will be ready for whether we have a Canadian or an Australian solution, and there will be jobs created in this country throughout the whole of the UK, not just in spite of Brexit, but because of Brexit. Because this country is going to become a magnet for overseas investment. Indeed, it already is and will remain so.
Quite how Keir Starmer can say whether or not he's going to vote for this deal without yet there being a deal or knowing what it is a sort of...
Yes, there are liberties being taken on both sides of this argument at the moment. But it's just, it is a classic exchange that we've come to see week after week from these two. Starmer says Johnson is a, fly-by-night merchant who occasionally pulls it out of the bag at the last minute, and Johnson responds that Starmer is an overweighted ditherer who has yet to tell us what he thinks. Points on both sides.
Let's go back to Keir Starmer.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister asked me how I'll vote on a deal that he hasn't even secured. Secure the deal, Prime Minister. You promised it. And I can say this, Mr. Speaker, if there is a deal, and I hope there's a deal, then my party will vote in the national interest, not on party political lines, as he is doing. Mr. Speaker, this is about leadership. The Prime Minister has done 15 U-turns. He's had 5 different plans on Brexit or on COVID. And last week, 53 of his own MPs voted against it. So if I were him, I wouldn't talk about leadership. The Prime Minister hasn't always wanted to listen to business. We know what his message to business is. But he should listen to them. Let me quote the CBI. They say the message for business is this: get a deal quickly. Then there's the National Farmers Union. Time is running out, they say. It's very hard to get the final preparations. These are the people the Prime Minister should be listening to, not his backbenchers. And on the question of preparation, the government knew months ago that it needed 50,000 customs agents trained and ready to go from the 1st of January, deal or no deal. So can the Prime Minister tell the House how many of the 50,000 agents will be in place on the 1st of January? That's 23 days' time.
Well, there was a lot in there. We both leapt for our pencils at that point when he said, if there's a deal, and I hope there's a deal, my party will vote in the national interest.
Well, that's a clever formulation that says we'll do whatever we damn well please when the time comes.
You are merely playing politics. I act in the national interest.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's fine. That's what any politician should seek to project. But it also gives him, the flexibility to do a deal with his own shadow cabinet and with his own party, depending on what Boris Johnson does or doesn't come up with. I do think it's a slightly curious argument that, Johnson might sort of pull this out of the bag at the last minute, like one of his Daily Telegraph columns. I just thought the public would have thought that was a pretty good thing for prime ministers to go around doing.
And if you get things done, albeit at the last minute, then
And there's been a lot of broad brush here, and I think what Starmer's done again there with the final bit of that, asking about these customs officers, that's a proper question to which there is presumably no good answer, because I suspect the number is either unknown to Boris Johnson or much smaller than 50,000. And this is where Starmer's good. We sometimes criticise him for being a bit too in the weeds and not doing the big picture argument, but it feels to me on this like he should have tried to do a little bit more detail, because the big picture is not one that he's in command of particularly.
Well, let's go back and let's see if Boris Johnson does answer that question.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's wonderful to get the end of that question. I can tell him that we've invested £1 billion already in getting this country ready for whatever the trading relationship is that we have on January the 1st, and 84 million into supporting customs agents across the UK, 200 million into supporting our ports, and they're doing an amazing... And I want to thank business for the incredible job they're doing of getting ready. We've all got to get ready, because under any view, there is going to be change from January the 1st. There will be a change in the way we do business. There will be more opportunities for this country around the world. And I'm delighted by what I take as the increasing signalling I'm getting from Camden. I apologise, Mr. Speaker. The message from Camden seems to be that actually, given the choice, the right honourable gentleman would vote for a deal rather than not. Did you get that impression? I think I did.
Hopefully we could have the final question a little shorter. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I take it that the answer is the Prime Minister's no idea whether the 50,000 customs agents will be in place on the 1st of January. He either doesn't know or he doesn't care. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister said he had a deal. He didn't. He said he would protect jobs. He didn't. He said he'd prepare for any outcome. He hasn't. And whatever may happen in the next few days, there's no doubting that his incompetence has held Britain back. So will he end this charade, end the uncertainty, get the deal that he promised, and allow the country to move on?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the right honourable gentleman for his final baffling question. Last week, he as I say, Sphinx-like, avoided any pronouncement on how this country was going to fight COVID. He refused to support the measures that we have put in place. This week, he remains deafeningly silent on what he really thinks about a Brexit deal. While he puts a cold towel round his head, Mr. Speaker, lost in thought, tries to work out what his position is, we are getting on...
To order. Mr. Bryant.
This is the Commons Speaker.
Mr. Bryant.
Talking to Chris Bryant there, the Labour MP.
I suggest the whip goes and has a word with him. We're not having that disgraceful behaviour. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think you should summon him back. He seems to have vanished. But while the right honourable gentleman tries to work out what his position is, we're getting on with the work of government. And it's as he says, it's a year since his People's Government was elected, and I'm very proud that we're delivering on the people's priorities. 6,000 of the 20,000 police officers, Mr. Speaker, 14,800 of the 50,000 nurses already, and we're getting on with building every one of the 40 hospitals, in fact 48 hospitals, that we're going to deliver, along with the biggest programme of infrastructure investment in this country for a century, uniting and levelling up across the whole of the UK. And whether the outcome is Canada or whether it's Australia, Mr. Speaker, we will be taking back control. And we have already taken back control of our money, our borders and our laws, and we will seize all the opportunities that Brexit brings.
Well, the most interesting thing from that exchange is what on earth it was that Chris Bryant said that provoked Lindsay Hall. It wasn't picked up by the microphones.
Bryant is a big Remainer, and I wonder whether he was having a sort of a pop at the Prime Minister there. It knocked him off his stride a little bit. I thought Starmer's question, which wasn't, of course, a question, it was a long statement that can go immediately on YouTube and Twitter. But, we criticise him sometimes for not really landing that final one with a bit of gusto. And what he did there was clearly designed to to clip for the news.
It mounted the argument with the soundbite at the end that sometimes we've been critical of him for not doing. He said he'd get a deal, he didn't. He said he'd protect jobs, he didn't. He said he would prepare for any outcome, he hasn't. And then urged him to get the deal that he promised so the country can move on. And that
will be used on the news.
That's
one of the jobs of the Leader of the Opposition. I thought that was effective. He could have delivered it with slightly more gusto. But that will,
it's difficult,
be seeing that on social media pretty soon. It's pretty difficult to perform with gusto in a whitewashed...
In your utility room with your pyjama bottoms on, or whatever it is that he's doing PMQs from. Keir Starmer self-isolating from home there. What do you think, we touched on it, Tim, briefly, but where is the challenge coming from for Boris Johnson? He clearly doesn't think he needs to worry too much about what the Labour Party is going to do on his Brexit deal. But what about the Tory backbenchers?
Well, I think broadly, actually, he's got them under control. I mean, the great secret in all of this is that the Prime Minister himself is the toughest in his own cabinet on Brexit. He knows that it happened partly because he decided to vote for it and campaign for it. Eventually, the first bit of the deal got over the line because he managed to become Prime Minister and force it through. None of us knows what's in his heart and mind completely about whether he wants to do a deal. His problem is with the EU, actually, much more than it is with his backbenchers at the moment. There is a deep philosophical difference between the kind of Brexit that Boris Johnson wants and the kind of Brexit that the EU wants to give him. Now, that doesn't mean they won't be compromised. There might be. But when you hear Angela Merkel saying they're prepared to live with no deal, we're clearly in the continuing to ramp up the rhetoric phase of this, and we've got a very short amount of time in order to get it over the line. But Boris Johnson, most of the Brexiteers, the people in the ERG that I spoke to over the weekend, they did not think he was on the verge of selling out. I think, if anything, he's likely to hold the line. There clearly will be some compromise on fishing, but on the principles of making our own rules, which is where the real crunch is, my impression is that there'll be some twiddles around the edges, but the main principle he's going to stick to. And if they don't like that, we probably will end up with, no deal Australia without the sunshine.
And I suppose the key point is that actually then if we do end up with no deal, it's not going to become an argument about, is this quite the Brexit we voted for? It becomes an argument about the economic impact of that.
And then what do you do about it? What does the government do to stimulate the economy, to protect the jobs that are hurt? You talk to anyone in the Treasury and they rightly point out, look, we've got a heck of a lot of safety net stuff in place at the moment for COVID. Brexit will come on top of that. It may be that we need to extend or deepen some of those schemes in due course, but it's not like there's nothing there at the moment. So there is, it may just look like COVID just got a bit worse, and at a time when COVID is sort of getting slightly less bad. So is Brexit really going to make it look, any worse than it did at the height of those two national lockdowns? Possibly not.
Well, it's all been happening because obviously not many MPs are allowed into the House of Commons chamber. While I've just noticed Pete Wishart, who's an SNP MP, he's appearing via home,
looking very angry
with his gold discs because he used to be in a
Run Rig.
Run Rig was the band he used to be in. So he's showing
off
his gold disc. But elsewhere in the Houses Department, because only 50 MPs allowed into the House of Commons chamber, Portcullis House has been evacuated by a fire alarm. Kerry McCarthy, the Labour MP, tweets. So she's sitting in the Bellamy's coffee shop with a coffee, listening to "Lonely This Christmas" by Mud.
Well, she could be listening to us, so,
exactly.
do better.
Exactly. You can download the Times Radio app and then you can listen to PMQs Unpacked live.